It was the year 1274. The sky was a flat gray lid, the kind that keeps secrets until the last moment. Out on the water, sails rose like a forest of pale spears. The Mongol fleet had come at last. Ships from Korea and China jammed the horizon, layered in ranks so dense that the distant waves looked caged. Oars lifted and fell in perfect rhythm. War banners snapped in the wind. The fleet glided closer, the way a hawk glides when it has already chosen its prey. On the headlands and beaches of Hakata, the samurai waited. They stood in small bands near their horses, bows bent across their backs, spears planted like young trees. Their armor was lace-like from a distance, but up close it looked like a wall of iron and lacquer. The air smelled of salt and pine pitch. Even before the first ship lowered its ramps, the watchers on the bluffs could see men with round shields and short powerful bows moving in organized blocks across the decks. It was not how warriors in Japan fought. Here, battles were a series of personal tests, names called out, duels decided in the space between two heartbeats. On those ships, the Mongols moved like a machine. At the center of the shore camp, a small pavilion stood beneath a cluster of pines. There the leaders had gathered. Shoni Kagesuk, the seasoned lord whose land and pride centered on this very bay, studied the sea for a long time without blinking. Beside him stood a younger commander, Takazaki Suenaga, restless as a horse at the sound of a gong. He had already asked permission to charge 3 times that morning. He would have asked a 4th if an older voice had not settled the circle, a monk in travel robes who had once been a samurai, his head shaven, his hand steady. He spoke softly, but the words reached them all. "Courage without order will drown here," he said. "Hold until you see the space where courage matters." They needed more than courage. Weeks earlier, messengers riding night and day had crossed the mountains to the regent, Hojo Tokumian, far to the east. He had sent orders, prayers, supplies. The men of the western provinces answered, their bonds woven as much from duty as from fear of disgrace. At Hakata, wooden screens were dragged into place and ropes stretched to guide horses. Pits were dug above the tide line. Scouts drifted along the hills like shadows. The samurai had prepared, but they had never faced anything like this fleet. The beach fell silent as a gong reverberated from the water. A line of ships angled in, lowered ramps, and spilled men into the surf. The first Mongol formations hit the shallows in tight clusters under shields roofed together. Arrow screens rose above them like brown rain. Short spears followed, thrusting forward in neat steps. Drums boomed. Reed pipes shrieked, bright and sharp. The beach answered with a long, wordless shout as the first riders leaped from the dunes. Suenaga was among them, his horse plunging through foam, the braided tie of his helmet snapping like a whip. He loosed, drew, loosed again, the arrows hissed, his spear bit into a shield and stuck there like a bee in bark. He dropped it and cut, fast, controlled, clean, and then was buried by a wave of shield men who would not separate for a duel. They pushed in teams, hit with hooks and short blades, struck his horse's shoulders. He bent low, kicked free, and carved space for breath. Around him the clash grew, not like a dance but like a storm. The Mongol archers fired in volleys. Their arrows came in sheets that warned no single man, they sought groups, edges, lines. Small ceramic pots arced above, struck sand, and burst with snaps of fire and smoke. Horses reared. Men ducked, coughed, blinked tears from their eyes. The earth itself seemed to cough. Some samurai tried to call out their names, demanding single combat, but the sound was swallowed by drums and by the number of enemies. Kagesuk, watching from the rise, marked the rhythm. The advance was a tide, steady and relentless. He turned to his officers. "Not here," he said, pointing to the flat beach where the shield lines had room to spread. "There." He indicated the rocky fingers where the coast broke into spits, where horses could hop and turn, where the enemy lines had to bend. Runners flew. Horns sounded. The line on the sand thinned on purpose. The riders wheeled, gave ground, reformed along the broken coast. The shift looked like retreat, and for a moment the Mongol front hurried to fill the vacuum. The surprise came then. From behind the rocks and brush, fresh bands of samurai burst forward. They had waited in silence, their horses breathing quiet steam. Now they struck from the side. Arrows angled in from the higher ground, where the wind helped and the sun angled under the cloud lid to sting the eyes. Mongol formations twisted to face this new threat, and their tight order loosened just enough to show seams. Swanaga, still alive, saw one seam open like a gate and drove in. His shout was swallowed by the noise, but his horse knew the line and took it. For a brief space he reached the very edge of the nearest ship ramp. He saw a man with a tiger-skin cap beating a drum with a stick bound in bronze. He saw a banner, green and black, ripple toward him. And he saw the trap, men tucked behind the ramp, fresh archers, waiting for a lone charge. He checked his horse, swerved out of the sight lines, and lived another minute. Down the beach, a young Ashigaru, one of the foot soldiers often treated as an afterthought by the mounted elite, spotted a different chance. He had spent nights helping dig pits above the tide line, and he had told anyone who would listen that there should be more. No one had listened. Now he watched the Mongols rush toward a low stretch of sand where the horses wheeled and left long curves. He planted his spear and shouted to 3 friends. Together they baited the line, fled on foot, and drew the shield men across the pits left shallow and disguised. The front rank plunged, found their ankles caught, and lost rhythm. Behind the momentum pushed men into men. For a few breaths the tide stopped. For a few breaths the sword and the spear were enough. But the enemy adapted. Officers with whistles reorganized the units by sound. Reserves flowed like water around a rock. The fleet sent in more men. The beach filled again, and now the Mongols probed farther up the coast, landing at points beyond the first line. Reports came in fast and hot. They're pushing toward the old storehouse. They're flanking the Pine Ridge. They are on the road to the shrine. Kage-suk listened, made choices. Some positions he let go with a calm face. Others he reinforced. The rhythm of the day became a chain of small retreats threaded with sudden counterblows. On the headland above the main anchorage, a group of archers under a veteran named Nikaido broke the monotony of advance, hold, fall back with sharp work. They had studied the wind at dawn. Now, whenever drums sounded for a fresh rush, Nikaido's men launched high-angle volleys at the signal banners. Not many arrows hit, but the ones that did threw confusion into the timing. Twice a rush started early. Once a rush came late. Each mistake opened a door for the defenders to shove. By afternoon, the beach was a patchwork of sand churned by hooves and feet. The surf ran brown. The gray lid of cloud hung lower, heavy as a held breath. Still the Mongols pressed. The watchers on the bluff counted ships, then stopped counting because the numbers did not change the reality: the enemy could feed men ashore faster than the defenders could rest. The samurai were fighting with grit and skill, but they were bleeding strength by the hour. Then, suddenly, the Mongols pulled back a little, as if someone had tugged a rope. The front line stepped into the surf and reversed course in good order. The men on shore cheered in confusion. It was not victory. It was a test. Drums rolled. Across the fleet, sails shifted. A new line of ships edged in, larger than the first, their sides higher, their decks crowded with archers and men holding tubes sealed in wax. The word moved through the defenders like a chill: reinforcements. What came next surprised both sides. Instead of rushing the beach again, the Mongol commanders used their new deck strength like a cliff. From the ships they unleashed tighter volleys, shadowing the shore with arrows that fell from angles the samurai bows could not match from the flat sand. Then crews on a few ships lit fuses and hurled earthen pots with spark tails into the shallows. The pots burst with shock and smoke, the sound more like a crack of the sky than a blast of fire. Horses flinched, even trained ones. Men dropped to one knee. The enemy was learning to keep the defenders at a distance, pin them while planning the next landing. Kage-suk had seen enough. He pulled the small circle of leaders close. "We hold the beach and we lose it," he said. "We have to change the rhythm." The monk nodded. "Night is a blade no shield can catch," he said. "Cut with it." They waited for dusk. The sun slid down a notch behind the cloud lid and left the world the color of iron. Torches flared on the ships. The enemy lit cooking fires. Voices drifted across the water, a low hum of men at rest, a few laughs, a few coughs, the faint rattle of gear. Anchors went down. The ships aligned in tidy rows, spaced like chess pieces, with smaller boats between the big ones as if to stitch the line tight. Mongol officers watched the shore from the rails, but it had been a long day, and confidence made the lids heavy. Along the beach, the samurai lowered their voices. A handful of small boats, patched and plain, slid from coves where they had been hidden behind reeds and brush. Each boat carried 8 or 10 men, archers, spearmen, a couple of brave souls with hooks and axes. Swanaga begged to join, and Kagesuk did not refuse. The urge inside that young man could be aimed like a spear if given the right throw. They pushed off without drums, without horns, with the paddles wrapped in cloth. The tide favored them, a slow inward pull that hid small mistakes. The rowers stroked with their whole bodies, using their backs more than their arms, easing the boats between lines of swell. In the lead, a lantern hooded with half a shell gave a finger of light to steer by. They aimed not for the big ships, despite the temptation, but for the seams where the anchors and ropes crisscrossed smaller boats into nets. The first sentry to spot them called out, but the sound was almost polite. "Fishing?" he asked in his own language, then realized what he was seeing one beat too late. Arrows whispered across the short gap. A rope was cut. A small anchor tumbled, and a link in the net went slack. Swanaga's boat swept along the side of a tender, men lunged, and the hooked iron bit. The samurai climbed like cats, low and quick, pushed the crew flat, and took the deck. A second boat did the same. The noise rose, shouts, clashes, a crash as a long oar fell, a whistle of alarm. Then came the true goal. At the back of the line, 2 bigger ships had tied to each other for safety, stern to stern with a shared anchor. The samurai slipped a boat between them. A spearman named Hachiro, nobody famous, no poem ever written for his name, had wrapped his arms in cloth soaked in oil and sand to take friction without skin. He flung himself over a rope thicker than his leg and sawed with a short blade as if cutting his own fear. The rope took time, but time had narrowed in the scream of whistles from the decks. When the fibers finally parted, it was like a cord snapping on a harp. The 2 ships swung apart. Anchors dragged. Small boats banged into large ones. Masts waved against the stars. That was the turning point the monk had meant, not a duel, not a single stroke, but a shift in balance. Where the line loosened, the tied units could not support one another. More small boats flowed in to make the looseness worse. Fires broke out on one ship, not great, hungry fires, just enough to draw men from stations to hold buckets and beat with wet cloth. The line sagged. Men shouted in 3 languages. Drums tried to rally a pattern and failed. The samurai pulled away as the fleet found its order again, and they returned to the shore alive in numbers no one had dared hope. The night hid their smiles, but not their eyes. Morning came with a wind. At first it was a traveler's wind, one that ruffles a horse's mane and shakes dew from grass. By mid-morning it had teeth. The sea turned a different color, darker, more serious. Flags pointed west in stiff angles, then snapped like small whips. Men on the ships looked up, measured the sky, and did not like what they saw. The Mongol commanders made the choice a careful man makes when a storm grows from a rumor to a fact. They pulled many of their forces off the beach and back to the decks. They still had the advantage in numbers, but numbers matter less when the water itself fights. Anchors groaned. Masts creaked, leaned, corrected, leaned again. The run of the swell changed direction, now broadside to the long lines of hulls. Boats that had been packed shoulder to shoulder were suddenly trying to swing different ways against ropes that insisted on order. On the shore, Kagesuk felt how quickly fortunes can turn. He did not waste the gift. He sent riders up and down the line with one order in plain words: press where they shake. The defenders did not throw themselves into the teeth of heavy volleys, they picked the thin places, the points where the enemy still tried to land despite the surge. At those points, the samurai became a saw, not a hammer. Swanaga led one of these rushes along a spit of rock that jutted into the bay like a pointing finger. The sea jumped, hissed, fell back, jumped again. 3 enemy boats came in awkwardly and tried to wedge themselves between weed-slick stones. The men inside had the look of seasoned fighters trapped in a clumsy cart. Swanaga's group hit as the boats rocked and caught them at the wrong angle. Blows landed on shoulders instead of shields. Oars tangled. A banner fell into the water and vanished like a leaf. The boats pushed off with frantic oars, leaving a few figures in the shallows doing their best to retreat with full armor as waves slapped their thighs. The samurai did not chase them deep. A wave can be an enemy harder to strike than any man. By midday, the wind had risen to a steady roar. The color of the world changed, the water went slate, the sky went tin, and everything else took on a harsh bright edge. Sails strained and cracked. Some tore. The Mongol fleet tried to pull into safer water beyond the headlands. Then nature, which owes no army favor, made a choice of its own. A band of rain came hard and sudden. In the space of a prayer it cut sight lines to a few boat lengths. The fleet could still move, but it could not move together. From the bluff, the monk raised a hand. "Do not follow blind," he warned. "Let the sea make the first cut." The men on the shore listened. They stayed just close enough to sting any landing effort but not so close that a gust could pin them against rocks and surf. It was restraint with teeth. Shouting rolled across the bay, thicker now. Somewhere out there a ship had lost its anchor and swung into a neighbor. The sound of hull on hull came through the rain like a judge's hammer. Another ship found the shallows and tipped, slow as a falling tree that still kills whoever stands beneath it. Small boats fought to escape the larger ship's dangerous swings. The neat grid of the fleet dissolved into clumps and gaps. The Mongol commanders were no fools, they saw that the shore had become less dangerous than the water. They signaled for withdrawal to deeper ocean. It was a hard call. To pull back meant giving the defenders a day without pressure, and a day was enough for messages to fly, for more men to gather, for nerves to turn from iron to steel. But to try to force the beach in a rising storm would risk losing so many ships that the invasion itself could break. The drums beat out the order. Sails were reefed. Oars took the strain. The gray day darkened early, as storms often do. The fleet slid away in pieces, picking paths through the chop like travelers on a mountain path trying to stay ahead of falling rocks. Those still on the beach did not cheer. The fighters breathed. They checked their gear and counted who still stood. They watched the fleet's backs with narrowed eyes because a wise man always expects a turn. That night the wind kept blowing. It did not become a raging monster, it became a big, stubborn animal that would not stop pushing. Out at sea, where no eye on shore could measure the exact pain, the Mongol ships fought against the push and twist. Some made it to safer waters. Others did not. The storm did what storms do, scattered what had been gathered with human labor. A line of floating strength became a long, thin string of hardships. At dawn the next day the fleet hovered beyond easy range, battered but not broken. The Mongols tested the shore with a few boats, found the defenders alert and stronger than before, and decided. The drums beat a different pattern, one the men on the beach had not heard yet, the signal to give up the ground and keep the ships. Banners dipped, came down, went up again in coded farewells. Oars went out in steady ranks. The fleet turned north, toward Korea and the long talk that follows when a great plan meets a harder coast. On the bluff above Hakata Bay, Kagesuk let his shoulders drop for the first time in days. He did not shout. He did not raise a fist. He simply closed his eyes and let the wind dry the salt on his skin. The monk beside him was already kneeling in the wet grass with his hands together, not for victory but for relief. Suanaga, who would have chased a whisper if given leave, watched the shrinking sails and felt something he had not felt since dawn on the first day. He felt the length of his life run through him, a long rope that could have been cut a dozen times but had not. Down on the shoreline, the foot soldier Hachiro stood with his hands on his knees, laughing to himself without sound. He had done what he could, cut a rope, bait a trap, keep steady, and it had mattered. The sea was still dark and cold, the wind still tasted of iron, but today he stood on the same beach where he had stood 2 mornings ago, and that felt like a miracle earned in sweat. News would run fast to the east. It would reach the regent, Hojo Tokimian, and the halls where calm men swallow worry for breakfast. It would run through villages and temples, through rice paddies and mountain paths. It would grow a little taller with each telling, more ships, more thunder, more heroes. It would polish the names of the famous and let the smaller names travel like sparks. And it would promise something both heavy and clear: the enemy would be back. For now, though, the beach belonged to the defenders. They walked the tide line picking up broken arrows, snapped oars, shattered pots. They found a banner tangled in kelp, green and black, heavy when wet. No man raised it. They folded it tight, set it aside, and went back to work. The sound of hammers began, quiet at first, then stronger, as carpenters and farmers alike started mending the things a battle breaks that are not men: fences, racks, boats, trust. In the weeks to come, more defenses would rise along this shore, walls of stone and packed earth, lines of stakes reaching out into the shallow water, channels cut to confuse landing boats. The men who had tasted the first invasion would pour what they learned into every fence post. They would plan for sails on the horizon, drums rolling like thunder, and men whose way of war turned duels into storms. They would plan to meet that storm with order of their own. The story of Hakata in 1274 is not the tale of a clean, shining victory. It is the tale of a line that bent but did not break, of brains used as boldly as blades, of night raids that used silence as a weapon, and of weather that tipped the scales without asking who deserved it. It is the tale of leaders who chose patience over show and of fighters who learned to prize tricky ground over a clear field. It shows how a force that loved single combat learned, in a hurry, to make teamwork a sword. Above all, it shows a simple truth that has lived on every shore since men first built boats: the sea is a second enemy, and sometimes it is a better ally than any army. In time, the Mongols would try again with a larger fleet and greater plans. The walls at Hakata would meet them. The wind would rise once more. But that is another chapter. This chapter ends on a gray afternoon that finally broke into a stripe of clear light. The sun fell below the cloud lid and turned the wet sand gold for a last brief minute. Men who had not slept much in 2 days stood quietly and watched that minute pass. Then they turned to their tasks: to feed the hungry, to bind the wounded, to write the names of the dead, and to make the coast harder to take tomorrow. The fleet, now a line of tiny teeth on the horizon, kept moving away, and the beat of its drums faded into the deep mouth of the sea. Thank you for watching, and if this tale held you close, please subscribe to Samurai Tales for more journeys into the age of the samurai.